Right, just to start off with, I thought it would be useful for you to have a sense of the content today. What I'd like to do, first of all, is just to do a general introduction. Then we'll start talking about pre-16 and the implications of some of the pre-16 reforms on university admissions. We'll then talk about the post-16 reforms and the implications for that. And then we'll finish off with some general observations about how universities are dealing with it. To start off with, then, there is, I think, an important qualifying statement I need to make, which is we in the higher education sector probably owe you in the schools and colleges sector a big apology. You've been grappling with the changes for quite a number of years now, and it's still clear that some people in higher education are only just waking up to the fact that there are significant changes coming down the pipeline. Part of the challenge in higher education is who you have available to do admission. So it depends on your university and it depends on your organisation structure. But broadly speaking, many of the people in universities who will be involved with making decisions on applicants are only doing it as an additional part of their full-time job, particularly where academic staff are heavily involved in the process. What you'll find is that they'll do it on a 2 or a 3 year cycle. So up until fairly recently, many of the people who'd be doing admissions knew that they probably weren't going to be around in 2017, 2018, 2019, when they would begin to see the first cohorts of students coming through on or with the new qualification. So to some extent, that's been part of the challenge for people like myself who are full-time admissions officers to engage and enthuse people. What we're beginning to find, of course, is staff who've got children themselves in the secondary sector are very interested now in what the institutional policies are because it has a direct bearing on their own children's outcomes. So you'll begin to see a lot more stuff if you haven't seen much up until now. I'll finish today when I'm finishing up talking about some of the resources that have been created, particularly through UCAS, the University and Colleges Admissions Service, and SPAR, supporting professionalism admissions, to assist schools and teachers in developing their own support for students. So the other thing that we're grappling with very much in universities, and most of the people I think who've logged in today are primarily in English schools, but we obviously have a four-nation issue here because Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland have all gone through quite significant reforms or are going through quite significant reforms. And if you are doing admissions, you have to be absolutely fair and transparent in the decisions that you are making. So when we get to things like equivalencies between the new GCSE scoring system in England and then trying to equate it to both Scotland, well, to Wales and Northern Ireland, who will retain GCSEs as lettered grades, IGCSE students, who of course will also retain lettered grades, and then the system in Scotland, you can appreciate that we're grappling with quite a number of issues and challenges. As part of the session on pre-16, I'll talk a little bit about what we've done at BAS so far, and hopefully that'll give you some context for the sector as a whole and the challenges that they're facing. And then finally, because this is a rolling reform, so we'll get some students coming in this 2017 entry cycle. We've obviously got BTEC students, for instance, who are coming in 2016 with a new reformed BTEC qualification, but all of this will not fully bed in until about 2019 entry, and universities will be adapting their policies until we reach a point where everything is stable. Those of you who've been working in education for more than about 6 months will appreciate that, to be perfectly honest with you, if we are in 2019 and we're in stability, something's probably gone wrong. I don't think, personally, we're going to find that the reforms as currently planned will just continue until they reach full maturity. We're bound to have further reforms and tinkering until then. Okay, so that's the situation that we're in. Could I just test whether the technology is all working at your end? Could you raise your hands if so far you've been able to hear and see everything that we've been talking about? Great, thank you very much. Okay, so moving on. We've got a number of key issues relating to the qualifications reform. I think probably one of the most significant ones that isn't being appreciated by higher education is the funding constraints, particularly in state sector schools, that will be driving some of the behaviours and some of the choices that schools are making. In the post-16 sector, obviously many of these funding changes have been ramping up since 2010. I think increasingly we'll find also in the pre-16 arena those changes will begin to bite and have effect. Just to kind of give a few areas where in particular we recognise that you are having challenges. There is a whole range of issues around students who may be struggling for all sorts of very good reasons to complete within the expected period for funding. So we will be in a position where, for instance, a student who takes 3 years to complete a qualification that should or would be expected to take 2, unfortunately, the funding in that 3rd year will reduce. And that has some implications because we know that there are factors that come in and will have a bearing on a student's progress. And if funding is going to start dictating to some extent how schools engage and react and are in a position to react to support students, then that obviously has a long-term bearing on that student's outcomes and success. We also, of course, are aware that curriculum offers will increasingly in the state sector be linked to the available funding. We're already beginning to see it. Many of you will be aware of the research that UCAS have been doing, looking at schools' plans and intentions. We're already beginning to see in many schools a reducing of the available offers in post-16 provision. My suspicion is that in the pre-16 choices at GCSE that students will have, things like accountability measures will also, along with funding, begin to reduce the choice and variation that schools will feel that they can offer to students. And that obviously for higher education has implications, particularly if you're offering a subject that students won't have had exposure to at school, because students generally, in my experience over 20 years, are quite conservative souls, bless them, and they'll often just look at things initially to do at university that they've had direct experience of or can obviously draw a line to. So adventurous choices like picking up sociology as a degree, if you haven't studied it in post-16 provision, there are some implications for subject disciplines where they don't have that obvious link. And then finally, I think on the funding constraints, we know that this will continue to be an issue, particularly in the state sector. So it's not something that even now we feel that it's been fully bottomed out. Moving on to pre-16 issues, I'll spend a bit of time talking about the GCSE scoring and where higher education is so far on its thinking. We're very conscious that the 9-to-1 scale has some set parameters. So those students who get a 7 under the new system in England will be the same sort of proportion of students who previously got an A. We know that a 4 will cover everybody who got a C or better under the old graded system. But then, of course, that leaves open all sorts of queries in higher education where we are using GCSEs as either a matriculation requirement, where we're expecting students to demonstrate a particular standard just to kind of meet our own internal requirements and expectations, or particularly for those subjects where something more than a C grade is currently required, because it often is a minimum competency to feel confident that the student will be able to cope with the demands of the course. So if I use Bath's experience as an example, for our business courses, except accounting and finance where A level is required, we would normally expect the students to have B in English language and in mathematics. For our psychology degrees, where we know that students will have to do statistics, where we know that language fluency and proficiency is an important part of their ability to cope with the course, then we currently generally expect students to get in grade A or better. But other universities use GCSEs as part of their contextualization of a student's background, and particularly the most selective universities will often be looking at A star as an indicator, and that obviously has implications where under the Welsh and the Northern Irish systems and in IGCSE, a student can get an A star, but within the New English system, of course, a 9 is the top 20% of students who are currently getting an A grade or an A star grade or better. But of course, that will be determined by the size of the cohort and the subject. So if it's something like English or Maths, where everybody pretty much will be doing it, well, obviously that has a reasonably good value and equivalency. If it's a very, very selective GCSE, where the ability range of the cohort as a whole is very high, then obviously maybe using a grade 9 will have implications for those students who end up with 8s, where the cohort actually it's a percentage of the overall ability group who will be achieving that. So we're very alive and concerned and conscious of the implications. So far in the discussions that I've had at Bath, there is a general understanding that where we're currently asking a grade A, we will ask for a grade 7. I think in the first couple of years of the new GCSE, where it's generally English and mathematics, where we're using it for matriculation purposes, we will err on the side of caution. So probably at Bath, we will be using a grade 4 as an equivalent to a grade C. The big debate so far has taken place around a grade B equivalency because it is generally being used as a competency to be confident the student will cope with the demands of the course. And at the moment, we are very much thinking that a 6 will be the equivalent to a grade B at Bath. Now, the sector as a whole really hasn't tended to engage with this because, of course, the first students we'll see with the new GCSE scoring system in England will not come through to us until 2019. But there is increasing encouragement from people like myself to colleagues in the sector as a whole to say that we need to get some clear decisions and information and discussion going on this, because for many students, if their GCSEs are not going to get them to the required level, then they're automatically being ruled out of certain degree courses. And if universities are vague and woolly and haven't given any clear direction, students may make decisions in their post-16 study predicated on assumptions about how GCSEs will stack up, and then suddenly find themselves adrift when subsequently universities start declaring their position. But I would think from probably now on in, a number of universities will start to make some indications about equivalence to C, B and A grades, and that should help push the rest of the sector forward. The big unknown for many of us is what professional bodies who will also have requirements on GCSE are going to require. So if we suddenly find, for instance, that those who provide the validation for our social work courses at Bath require our students to have a grade 5 instead of a grade C, then that will require us to move our offer up from a 4 in fairly short order. Again, the discussions that we've had at Bath have said that where a professional body requires a change, we will make it. But for the institution as a whole, where it's not a requirement for a particular professional validation, we will stick with a 4 as a C, at least until we get the sight of how it's panning out in students' behaviour and also in students' ability to engage. So, spent a lot of time there on GCSE, but I appreciate for many of you this will be one of the questions, particularly for parents' evenings, that you're beginning to get directed at you. And I think it's hopefully helpful to give you a sense of where the sector currently is on thinking on that. Another key area for us in the higher education sector to even begin to understand, never mind factor into our processes, is how the many new accountability measures will have a bearing on your behaviour and maybe forcing your hand in particular decisions that you'll be making. Back in the day when a C grade was the only real progression measure at 16, it obviously drove particular behaviours in some schools. So you had often large numbers of the most able students being entered multiple times for GCSEs, particularly areas like maths and English, where this would have a bearing not just on school performance tables, but sometimes also on school funding issues as well. It had the impact often that students would be taking GCSEs in years 9, 10 and 11, so effectively doing multiple resits. That obviously was closed off as an option about a year and a half ago now. But it does, and we do know that it meant that many of the most able students were being encouraged to do lots of GCSEs, because 13 grade Cs for the school might have more value than 10 grade As or grade A stars for the same student. Obviously, Progress 8, Attainment 8, the EBAC, all of these things still need to be bottomed out. I'll try and give you some good news. So at the moment, no university, to my knowledge, is requiring the EBAC as any sort of criteria for admission. And those universities who've given any thought to the issue have made it very clear, so Oxford University, for instance, has done this, have made it very clear that if they do require the EBAC for any reason whatsoever, and it'll have to be an evidence base that it actually helps students cope with their time in higher education, then they will only introduce it as a requirement in a time scale that would allow students to take it on board and engage with it. So effectively, if Oxford tomorrow decided that they wanted to use the EBAC, they would not bring it in as a requirement until 5 or 6 years from now, until the message had got out and students had had a chance to engage. So, accountability measures we know will have a bearing on school behaviour, particularly if it starts getting linked to funding, if it starts getting linked to league tables. Initially, we've already seen in many schools a reduction in the number of GCSEs that students will be expected to do. That's not necessarily a bad thing, provided that any time that brings back into the pre-16 curriculum is used to kind of develop their students' understanding, awareness, knowledge, rather than what we fear might happen, which is it's effectively used just to try and push the grades up. We're very keen, I think, for students to have a well-rounded education, and hopefully, rather than have staff teaching to the test, any additional time that you get back in the pre-16 curriculum will allow you to develop students' awareness and understanding of the subject, maybe on aspects that aren't necessarily just going to be covered by an examination. On the curriculum front at pre-16, there's obviously a lot of concern across the sector, both I think in the school sector and also in the university sector, about the very clear focus that there's being given on mathematics, and a very simple question whether we have enough mathematicians available in schools to actually teach not just the pre-16 students with the new FAT GCSE, but also provide the equivalent support post-16 for students who haven't managed to get a C grade, or is it a 4, is it a 5 grade or better in mathematics in their sixth form studies, and cover areas like core mathematics, and actually teach A-level and any other requirements in mathematics that schools might require. So there's some real challenges, I think, there. The Welsh Assembly, when this was raised, because they were also quite keen to develop the mathematics provision in Wales, did recognise that there were going to be some challenges around mathematics provision. It's obviously a more significant issue in England, just given the scale of the number of schools, the number of students relative to Wales. Another area of concern, particularly at somewhere like Bath, where so many of our students will do a placement year as part of their degree and may spend time studying abroad, is whether students will be doing more than one GCSE in a modern language. I think again, attainment measures and progress measures will have a bearing on this. We know that many schools, just to get the economies of scale to make a GCSE financially viable, are having to make hard decisions and saying, you know, rather than having a small group doing German and a small group doing Spanish and a small group doing French, we will offer one language, might be Spanish. We've certainly seen a rise in applications nationally for students doing Spanish, and declines pretty much everywhere else in modern languages. So we may find that actually the range of choice in languages that students have will be diminished quite considerably. And again, it'll probably be more guided by funding rather than any pedagogical issues. We're also quite concerned, I think, because of the attainment measures, that there'll be a disincentive for students to do 3 separate GCSEs covering biology, physics and chemistry, because of course it's only 2 sciences that count towards many of the progression measures. That has implications for many courses in many universities. Again, Bath with a very strong emphasis on STEM and engineering subjects, as well as in the social sciences and business, having courses where students would benefit from fairly broad-based knowledge and understanding and awareness across the range of disciplines. I think where there is general concern in the sector, higher education sector, that decisions that will be guided more by funding and progress measures will have a bearing on the range of choices that students have in their post-16 study. And then finally, something that's been obviously very much all over the news is the implications that particularly the EBAC subjects have had on areas of creative activity. Again, Bath is not a university that has degrees in drama and fine art and dance, but we do have a very active student body who will often undertake a range of activities outside their subject discipline, and we would certainly worry if we were seeing fewer and fewer students coming through the sector who've been able to develop and demonstrate their engagement and interest in the creative arts. Can I just check again with a hand-raising exercise to see whether people are happy with the level of detail that we've had so far? Thank you. Okay, if we move on to post-16 issues, this is an area obviously where I feel much more in my comfort zone. There has been a lot of discussion about whether schools will be doing 3 or 4 A-levels. The research that UCAS has been doing would suggest that for the time being, until we reach the point in 2018 when all schools will, all the new A-levels will have moved over to the new linear system, there still seems to be a real reluctance to abandon the option of a 4th AS level. And I think from my recollection of the UCAS research, round about 2/3 to 3/4 of schools were saying that whilst there'd be a mix of linear and modular A-levels, they would continue to try and offer 4 subjects. A few schools have already, however, indicated that this is unlikely to be sustainable, particularly in the state sector, beyond 2018, and some have already taken a jump to offer a very clear 3 choices at 16 for A-levels, usually supplemented by something like an extended project qualification, and then some form of enrichment activity built into the curriculum as well. As far as higher education is concerned, most universities who've published statements have been very, very clear that decisions that schools have had to make, often with the best interests of students at heart, sometimes guided by funding decisions, means that effectively there will be a range of options available to students. Universities are not in any of their published statements saying that they have a preferred route. They're recognising that this is a period of flux and change, and the system will take some time to settle in. There are a number of people working at the sort of level I am in universities as directors who remember what happened with Curriculum 2000 and the changes there. So we also know that some of what's been intended will never ever really see the light of day. It won't gain traction. So rather than force schools down any particular route, then I think the higher education sector is standing back and saying, well, we'll just wait for the dust to settle. That, of course, doesn't help you in the school sector or the college sector, because actually possibly what you'd want is the universities to just make some decisions, and then at least you could factor in for all the change. So we're in a kind of catch-22 Mexican standoff situation. I think what I'm beginning to see is a growing interest in higher education in the extended project qualification. There's a body of evidence to suggest that it develops a range of skills that A-levels have not traditionally developed, and a number of universities, probably led most notably by University of Southampton, are beginning to build into their offer-making policies opportunities for students who have done an extended projects alongside 3 A-levels to have an alternate offer. It's certainly something that we are looking at very seriously at Bath. For a number of years, we've been very positively disposed towards students who've done project work. We responded when there were changes to the Welsh baccalaureate core, and many of our courses, almost all of our courses in fact now, will make opportunities for students doing the Welsh bac core to have an alternate offer. And in the most recent discussions that we've had in our curriculum and qualifications review group here at Bath, we've already kind of indicated that from 2017 entry onwards, we will be looking at making alternate offers to students who have a project. They will need to perform well to qualify for the alternate offer, and we won't take an offer off students. So, for instance, if our standard offer is an A-star AA, what we'll do is we'll give a student who's doing a project in EPQ the option to also have the offer as 3 A's and then an A or an A-star in their EPQ. We won't expect the student to decide which of those 2 offers they'd prefer. The intention is to give some flexibility and recognising, as I've said, that a student who's performed well in an EPQ generally is showing a range of skills that would fit them well for university. We've also found in the work that we've been doing looking at EPQ and in the Welsh bac project, actually the topic that students do shouldn't be a determining factor as to whether they get an alternate offer. That's partly recognising that many students will pick their project topic long before they've decided on a choice of course at university, but also because it's the skills that they develop that are being seen as valuable. So the time management skills, the research skills, the evaluation and critical thinking skills that a good project result will develop. We are going to also, I think, keep this under close monitoring because obviously as the numbers of students coming through ramp up. At the moment, it's about 9% of our intake to Bath will do some form of extended project qualification. We've got a lot of students who apply to Bath who are doing the international baccalaureate and obviously do the extended essay. And because of our geographical location, we have quite a lot of Welsh students coming, particularly from South Wales. So we've got quite a body of evidence that's building up to assist us in this. On the field of vocational qualifications, fairly unusually for a university that tends to score well in league tables and is very selective for many of its courses, we have a high proportion of our students in certain disciplines who are doing the BTEC or equivalent qualifications. We've recognised that for many of those students there are adjustment challenges coming into the first year of a degree, and we've put in place the appropriate support. It's particularly marked in many cases where students are doing subjects where they are required to do fairly high-level statistics and numerical analysis. So we have a particular unit at Bath, the Maths and Statistics Help Unit MASH, who've developed a range of programs for first-year students in transition with BTEC. We're obviously waiting to see what the impact is of the increased expectation that students will have to have external assessment and the reduction in the number of submissions that students can make for individual course elements. We'll get a very clear view, obviously, this summer coming, because we'll have the first cohort of students through under the new examination and assessment regulations for the vocational qualifications. We're also beginning to see an increasing number of students who are mixing vocational qualifications alongside A-level, and again, the research that UCAS has been doing in this area suggests that for economies of scale, many schools are increasingly moving in this direction in the state sector. So the other area that there's a real gap in information is very few universities will publish their entry requirements for students doing the mixed combination of A-level and BTEC. And I think this is something that's going to have to change fairly rapidly because students will vote with their feet if they see no recognition in university prospectuses or on websites of the combination of subjects that they're going to be doing. Then they will take that as a sign that the university is either disinterested or unaware of the support that those students will require and the information they require to make informed decisions. We've had some fairly interesting conversations recently at Bath about core mathematics. I think there's a general awareness that it's another thing that's being put into the post-16 curriculum, so time and finance are going to contribute towards take-up. Our most recent discussions have identified that for a number of our degree courses where numeracy is highly valued but isn't required at A-level standard, we will be able to make some fairly positive comments, I think, about students who do core mathematics as a way to help us differentiate between students who maybe have stopped studying maths at GCSE. We won't just be using core mathematics as a guide because there are other ways that students can develop numeracy skills, but I think it's been a useful prompt for us to think again in some of our subjects about what we want, what we expect, and what would be seen as desirable in applicants. There's also been some positive thought in areas like natural sciences, where at the moment some options that students pick would require A-level maths, and we've basically said, therefore, to apply for the course, you would need A-level mathematics. I think our view is that if we have something like core mathematics available to us, we may be able to utilise that as an entry requirement, where students are doing subjects such as biology or chemistry, rather than in areas where they're doing, say, physics and mathematics as part of a natural sciences degree. So it's giving maybe a bit more flexibility and a few more options available to students if they opt to take core maths in their post-16 study. Finally, for those subject disciplines where we're requiring, at the moment, Bs and As, and in future 6s and 7s GCSE, if students have done core mathematics, then we'll be able to take core mathematics as an alternate to meet the conditions for entry. So again, a student who, for whatever reason, hasn't maybe quite attained at GCSE, but decides that they themselves want to continue and move forward in their maths post-16, something like core mathematics would give us an option to consider them for something like psychology, where we're asking quite a high demand on the GCSE subjects. And then finally, on post-16, again, there's a range of accountability measures. The facilitating subjects is one area I know where there's been an awful lot of debate in schools and colleges, and again, misinformation can often drive applicant behaviour, student behaviour and parental behaviour. No university course, to my knowledge, in the entire country requires a student to have more than 2 facilitating subjects, and most don't even require that. And if I look at behaviours and experiences of friends and my own children, it is not a requirement to get into a selective university to do 3 facilitating subjects. And I think the use of facilitating subjects in the league tables is a misunderstanding of what that information was ever intended to do. I worked at a Russell Group university when the Russell Group drew up their guidelines, and we were very much intending it as a way to assist and help students make more informed decisions about what options might exist to them. It was never being seen as a progression measure or an attainment measure or a barrier to provide students to get to university. I think, again, looking at the behaviours of both Bath and at other universities where I'm familiar, that whole debate has helped universities move forward and made it much more transparent, hopefully, in what we are asking for. Certainly the policy at Bath is that we will spell out very clearly to applicants what we require, and if it's not mentioned as something that we require, then you should assume that whatever you are doing is suitable and fine, and we're not going to hold it against you about decisions that you've made when you're 16, 17, picking choices of post-16 subjects. I think there is a general concern, though, across the sector that the amount of guidance that students have available to them is much more limited now than it ever has been, which is a real worry in a situation where we have so many more options and so many more alternatives to students. And without independent careers guidance and an increasing reliance on schools who are already strapped for resources and staff and cash, this is becoming, I think, quite a worrying concern, particularly if students increasingly will narrow down their choices of subject at 16 to only 3 subjects. Those of you who were teaching in the 1990s will be familiar with the consequences of that, which would be you'd often find students doing incredibly well in 2 subjects and then tanking desperately in a 3rd subject. And that will have implications for higher education admissions if you start seeing more students coming through with A, B, D profiles, particularly where the D might not be in a subject relevant to the degree scheme. Back in the 1990s, that was often waived. We're obviously in a very, very different world now, given the number of students who are going to university and given the general competitiveness of some courses. Just to finish off with, we'll cover the issue around university admissions. Sorry, I appear to have, there we go. Haven't been using the screen enough, so it all disappeared for a moment, but we're back again. On university admissions, there are a few things I just want to finish up with. Many of you will be familiar with the increased tendency for many universities to give unconditional offers to students who have yet to complete their qualifications. I think personally, this is going to be, it's a retrograde step for universities to be moving and doing this. There is a lot of evidence, I think, to suggest that their A-level and post-16 qualification results do have a bearing later in life, often if they're going for graduate jobs. Companies, one of the first questions companies will ask is, how did you do at A-level? And it's often used as a first sifting tool. For those of you who want a bit more background to this issue, there is some information on the University of Bath website. Bath is not a university that provides unconditional offers to students who have still to complete their qualifications, and we've tried to explain to applicants and parents and to guidance advisors exactly why we've adopted that position. I think it's going to become increasingly challenging to universities to make unconditional offers, particularly with the increasing demise of AS results. At the moment, you can look at a candidate's AS profile, and if they're showing A's, B's in their profile, you can be reasonably comfortable that there's something in the bank there. I think the challenge is going to be if we don't have that information and if students are not taking AS levels, which seems increasingly likely from 2018 onwards, then there will be real challenges in whether any of the predictions that are being made, how those predictions have been arrived at and how accurate they are, and therefore how confident a university could be over giving an unconditional offer. I think we're also very conscious, as I've said already, that some of the prerequisites that we ourselves express for particular courses will need to be revisited, partly in recognition of the changes to the scoring and grading, partly as a recognition that choices that students might have, options, the amount of freedom that schools have to offer particular subjects may no longer be there. And therefore, if you are requiring for a course a particular A-level subject, I think universities are going to have to take a long, hard look as to whether that's something that realistically they could expect the majority of applicants to have access to. I think the area in the sector that we've got the most concern at the moment is what will happen with further mathematics following reform in 2017. For many of the most competitive universities in many STEM subject disciplines, further mathematics is being used increasingly as a requirement rather than an option. And if we see a significant drop-off in students doing further mathematics because the schools can't fund it, that has significant implications for engineering, for physics, for mathematics departments, for computer science departments, in a range of additional areas. We know that you as teachers and college lecturers obviously already spend a lot of time and energy in supporting your students by providing them with references. I think what we're going to find as the qualifications reforms bed in is that references and personal statements are probably going to become, again, significant in the admissions process. We will have to rely very heavily on your views as a teacher of the student's ability, and there's some excellent advice being given by UCAS and SPAR, Supporting Professionalism and Admissions, as to how you might want to start thinking about writing references going forward. There's also advice about additional information that wouldn't necessarily be contained within the body of the reference, but could be linked to the reference and stored as a kind of general statement of the school policy in pre and post 16 education that universities could then link through to when they're looking at an application to try and get an understanding of the context in which a student has been guided. And again, the information that we've got later in the guidance for today will give you a link through to that information. We're also, I think, waking up to the fact that for some subject disciplines there is a real danger that their pipeline of existing students will just dry up. In a fairly recent conference I attended where they were looking at post-16 provision, the suggestion was made that for an A-level now to be financially viable, you will need at least 14 students in a cohort to probably cover the costs. Well, that obviously has significant challenges for some of the language disciplines, for subjects that are not taught at GCSE, where students may not have the confidence, if they're not given the chance to do 4 subjects post-16 initially, to try a new subject entirely. And that obviously covers a lot of the social science disciplines, some of the humanities disciplines, like art history, such as some of the areas in classics, for instance, where students might not ever pick up study of a subject if they're limiting themselves or limited to 3 choices in their post-16 provision. So it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the issues. I hope you found it useful. We do have some additional information available. In conclusion, think that this is an evolving area for universities to engage with. We'll see more information coming through from higher education as they begin to see students coming through the system. One area in particular I think that universities are feeling challenged at the moment is those who use contextual information about school performance are suddenly realising that much of their existing data is going to rapidly go out of use and value, and it'll take us typically 2 or 3 years to construct that information again for it to be helpful in the admissions process, because you will want to see evidence of how students are behaving once they get on their degree course before you can draw any real conclusions about how context and prior attainment can be a guide to on-course activity and attainment. So some of the tools that we've had for a number of years to assist and help, particularly for some of the most selective courses in universities, I think is going to have to be refreshed and rethought over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. Finally, I think for those of you who don't yet have strong links with your local universities, please reach out. It's increasingly clear to me that we are getting the most valuable intelligence in our decision making at Bath from the interactions that we're having with schools and colleges who are now teaching the new qualifications. And I think that your first-hand experience can be a very powerful tool when people like myself are going to university committees and talking to our academic colleagues in departments and saying, well, you may have read this in the newspaper, but actually the first-hand experience that we were having from colleagues in schools and colleges who are teaching the new syllabus and the new curriculum suggests otherwise, and this is why. So I think increasingly local networks of universities and schools, such as the Western Outreach Network, who are supporting today's webinar, will become increasingly important as a route and a conduit to universities making better, sharper, more informed decisions about what's realistic in their expectations and aspirations for students in the admissions process. I'll finish my formal presentation there, but hopefully I've given you plenty of food for thought, and you'll probably want some questions. The resources, by the way, I've been quietly reminded, are over on the next couple of slides, and obviously we'll email them out to you as well. So if there are any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, we've got one question coming through from Helen Varley, hopefully, or maybe she's just typing to say she's off. If any of you, by the way, feel that this has been useful, obviously we'll be recording it and you can utilize it in any internal training you're doing. Another area where this may be valuable, if you feel it would be useful as part of a local schools network for me to come and talk, then I do try and get out from behind my desk every so often. So if at all possible, if you're interested in a presentation to a group of schools, I'd be very, very happy to come as part of an inset day or a training, or find colleagues from other universities who could maybe fulfill that role. But I do think that dialogue's really important. Helen's asked, can we take the entry requirements on the university website as read in general? Are there any secret entry requirements behind the scenes? I think it's fair to say that recent legislation from the CMA, the Competition Markets Authority, is really focusing university admissions tutors' minds on what they should and need to say. I think the limitations of the paper prospectus are that you can only put so much information in. It wouldn't allow you to think about every permutation. So university websites are always a much, much better source of information. One of the things that the CMA have made very clear is you need to be able to audit any changes you make to your website around admissions activity and requirements, just to make sure that you don't get halfway through the cycle and then suddenly stick the offer level up or add in a requirement for a particular subject to try and restrict flow and demand. And I think, again, this is something in the past that's maybe been a challenge to teachers who are trying to provide good and clear guidance, and then partway through a cycle, the university does something and changes. As far as hidden requirements, I think the advice I'll give to students is get things in writing. So if a student is concerned and worried about their circumstances, if they're not convinced that the information that they've read is clear, then I drop the university an email setting out the question, setting out the qualifications that you might happen to have, and therefore I think it would be useful for you to be able to get that information in writing, so that if it's ever challenged at a later stage, you've got a clear audit trail yourself about the fact you've asked the question. Are there any other questions? I hope that's answered your question, Helen. Please get back to me if it hasn't. Thank you. Are there any more questions? I see many of you are filling in the evaluation. Thanks for those of you who have. That's really helpful. And if you've not sure whether it's been of any value, please feel free to ask a question, because hopefully that will add to the value of the session as far as you're concerned. Okay, Well, no more questions coming through. I don't want to delay you. This is only Monday of a long week, I'm guessing. So if there are no more questions, I'll give it another couple of seconds. And if you haven't yet filled in the evaluation, I'm sure my colleagues at One would be delighted if you could give them the feedback so we can improve for any future work that we do using this as a medium for communication. We will be, just to remind you, we'll be emailing the recording and the slides to any of you who've logged in, and also I'll recirculate, because I couldn't attend or run the session on the 1st of February as originally planned, the document that kind of summarises my university's thinking on most of these issues, plus a whole lot of other stuff that I haven't had the chance to cover today, and hopefully that'll be of some value to you. Okay, thank you very much. And if there are any questions that occur to you subsequently, please feel free to email me at the University of Bath. It's m.nicholson, Nicholson, @bath.ac.uk. Thank you very much.